On March 19th, 2024, the Smiley home in Brandon, Mississippi, should have been just another quiet suburban house, ending another ordinary school day. Inside lived 40-year-old math teacher Ashley Smiley, a respected educator who had been honored as Teacher of the Month and who spent her career lifting up the kids she taught. But on that day, inside that house, her own 14-year-old daughter, Carly Madison Gregg, was unraveling into someone no one recognized. Not her teachers, not her friends, not even her stepfather, and certainly not Ashley. What happened inside that home became one of Mississippi's most disturbing juvenile murder cases in decades. A case where a teenage girl stood calmly in a Nirvana T-shirt over the body of her murdered mother, texting a friend messages that stunned even seasoned investigators. Ever seen a dead body? But to understand how it got there, you have to go back to the confrontation that morning. A friend had contacted Ashley to tell her that Carly had been using marijuana, keeping burner phones, and hiding vapes. When Ashley came home, she searched her daughter's room and found vape pens. She confronted Carly, leading to a heated argument. To Ashley, this was a mother trying to set boundaries. To Carly, prosecutors argued, this became something far darker, a trigger she couldn't or wouldn't control. At some point that afternoon, alone in the house, Carly went into the bedroom she shared with her parents and took her mother's Magnum pistol. Investigators never said exactly where in the room it was kept, only that it belonged to Ashley and that Carly knew where it was. She retrieved a gun, walked out, and waited. When Ashley entered the living room, the first shot ripped through the quiet. Surveillance audio captured not silence, but screams, followed by 2 more shots. The wounds were fatal. A teacher beloved by her students, another adored by her family, collapsed to the floor. Seconds later, the security camera in the kitchen caught something surreal. Carly, walking calmly in view, her phone in hand, her expression flat. She wasn't frantic or horrified. She didn't call 911. Instead, she texted a friend about the body. The friend eventually came to the house, looked at Ashley lying dead on the floor, and left, later cooperating with police. On that footage, jurors watched Carly stroke the family dog. They watched her scroll. They watched her walk past the body, again and again. Prosecutors said there was no panic, no shock, no remorse, only composure. Then came the next part. Using Ashley's phone, Carly sent a message to her stepfather, Heath Smiley. "Are you almost home, honey?" Prosecutors said it was deliberate, an attempt to lure him back for the second stage of what they described as a planned attack. Heath arrived at the house roughly an hour after Ashley had been shot. He stepped inside and saw Ashley on the floor. Before he could process what he was seeing, Carly fired. Despite the shock and the pain, he tackled his stepdaughter, wresting the gun out of her hand. While he tried to call 911, Carly fled out the back of the house. Officers arrived within minutes. At 5:07 p.m., they received the first emergency call. By around 5:30 p.m., barely 20 minutes later, they found Carly in a nearby yard and arrested her. Inside the home, investigators found the evidence of what happened next. Carly had hidden the .357 pistol, and the kitchen security camera, the one that captured her calm movements, had been removed from its mount and placed inside the refrigerator. That single act became the core of the tampering with evidence charge. The trial moved with remarkable speed for a murder involving a juvenile. Less than 6 months after the crime, September 2024, Carly went before a jury as an adult. She was now 15 years old. The prosecution's case was chilling. They played the surveillance footage. They played the audio of Ashley's screams. They read the text messages. They described how Carly invited a friend to see her mother's body. And they pointed to the message sent from Ashley's phone as evidence that she intentionally drew Heath home to attack him next. The district attorney summed it up with a line that resonated across the courtroom. Sometimes evil comes in young packages. The defense painted a different picture. They called experts who testified that Carly was severely depressed, had recently switched medications from Zoloft to Lexapro without a proper transition, and was spiraling. One psychiatrist said Carly reported having no memory whatsoever of what she did after coming home that day. They argued she didn't fully grasp the consequences of her actions, that she wasn't thinking like an adult, and that her mind simply broke. But the state countered with its own experts, doctors who said she wasn't psychotic, wasn't hallucinating, and had denied hearing voices in earlier evaluations. They said the surveillance footage itself contradicted any claim she didn't understand reality. After 4 days of testimony, the jury deliberated, and in September 2024, they found her guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and evidence tampering. The judge sentenced her to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years. She was 15 years old. In the months that followed, her legal team filed appeals, arguing mandatory life without parole for a juvenile violates the Constitution. Advocacy groups emerged, names like Carly's Warriors and Justice for Carly Gregg, arguing that severe depression, unstable medication changes, and adolescent brain development should have been considered more heavily. Prosecutors and Ashley's family rejected that framing entirely, saying the footage and evidence speak for themselves. Because no matter what explanation you look at, the facts remain the same. A beloved teacher and mother was shot 3 times by her own child. A stepfather barely survived being ambushed. And a small Mississippi community had to grapple with something they never expected to see. A murder so cold, so deliberate, carried out by a girl barely old enough to drive. In the summer of 1998, Tampa, Florida looked like any other suburban paradise. Strip malls, palm trees, quiet cul-de-sacs. But inside one Carolwood home, the relationship between 15-year-old Valessa Robinson and her 49-year-old mother, Vicki, was collapsing. Vicki was a real estate agent and a single parent, desperately trying to pull her daughter back from a downward spiral of running away, drugs, and a controlling 19-year-old boyfriend named Adam Davis. She had even begun exploring Christian boarding schools, hoping structure might save her daughter before she vanished into something darker. But Valessa didn't see rescue. She saw restriction. She saw someone taking away the boy she loved, and she saw her mother as the one obstacle between her and complete freedom. By late June, the tension was electric. On the night of June 26th, Valessa met up with Adam Davis and their friend, 19-year-old John Wispel. The 3 drifted, as they usually did, to a Denny's, one of those late-night hangouts where teens lingered in booths until sunrise. They ordered food. They complained about life. They talked about how Vicki was trying to separate Valessa from Adam. Then came the decision that changed everything. They left the restaurant, took LSD together, and returned once the hallucinations started creeping in. Sitting in that booth, high on acid, Valessa giggled and said a line that would later echo through courtrooms. "Let's kill my mum." At first it sounded like a teenager being dramatic, but the conversation didn't stop there. Adam started strategizing. John listened, and the more they talked, the more real it became. Adam's first idea was to fake an overdose. He tried buying heroin from a friend so they could inject Vicki and make it look accidental. When he couldn't get heroin, bleach became the substitute poison. It was clumsy, reckless, and deadly. By the time the trio left Denny's, they had a plan. They arrived at the Robinson home after 2 a.m. Vicki was awake and alert. She had been waiting for Valessa to come home. When she saw the teens walk in, she asked Valessa to get her sleeping bag and come to her bedroom so they could talk. Instead, she walked straight into an ambush. In the hallway near the kitchen, Adam came up behind Vicki and put her in a sleeper hold. She fought back, confused and terrified, asking what they were doing. As Adam held her, he told Valessa to help, and she did. Valessa physically restrained her mother while Adam prepared the syringe. Vicki was fighting for her life as Adam injected her with bleach. It didn't kill her, so he tried choking her again. When that failed, he grabbed a knife and stabbed her repeatedly until her body finally went still. In those moments, a mother who had spent years trying to save her daughter from self-destruction died at the hands of the very people she had tried to protect her from. while her own child held her down. When the violence stopped, the teens panicked. They grabbed bleach and towels and scrubbed the kitchen, trying to erase what had just happened. Then, they dragged Vicki's body into the garage and stuffed her into a large plastic trash can. They loaded shovels and a hoe into her minivan and drove to a wooded area near Morris Bridge Road, where they tried to dig a grave. The ground was too hard, too uneven, so they covered the trash can with branches and left it there. They told themselves they'd come back, but instead of returning to hide the body, the three teenagers checked into a motel in Ybor City, a nightlife district filled with tattoo shops, clubs, and late-night energy. For days, they drifted through that neighborhood, using Vicki's ATM and credit cards, buying tattoos, supplies, and whatever else they wanted. They weren't running in fear. They were hanging out, high, spending her money, acting like the world hadn't just ended for an entire family. Eventually, they hit the road, but they didn't go north. They headed west on Interstate 10 toward the Florida Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then Texas. They bought concrete mix, a bucket, and another trash can from Home Depot in a bizarre plan to entomb Vicki's body in cement and dump it in a canal, but they never went back to the woods. The trash can with Vicki inside stayed right where they'd left it. On July 2nd, 1998, almost a week after the murder, the three were spotted at yet another Denny's, this one in Texas. Their use of Vicki's cards had triggered alerts. Police surrounded the area. Adam tried to escape, leading officers on a chase that was broadcast live on local TV. The minivan eventually screeched to a stop. All three teens were arrested. Back in Florida, detectives recovered Vicki's body. The sight was devastating. A respected mother and hard-working woman left in a plastic trash can in the brutal summer heat. The legal consequences were severe. Adam Davis, who wielded the knife, was convicted of first-degree murder. He was originally sentenced to death, but after years of appeals and legal changes, his sentence was replaced with life without parole in 2021. John Wispel cooperated with prosecutors early, admitted his involvement, and testified against the others. He pled to second-degree murder and received 25 years, eventually being released in 2019. And then there was Valessa. At 15, she became the center of a debate that split Florida. Was she a vulnerable kid, manipulated by an older boyfriend, or a cold participant in her own mother's killing? Prosecutors argued she wanted her mother dead, assisted in the attack, and joined the cleanup and cover-up. They pointed to her behavior afterward, the tattoos, the motels, the spending, as proof of her mindset. The defense insisted she never struck the fatal blow, that Adam controlled her, and that she was just a scared teenager in over her head. The jury struck a middle ground. Valessa was convicted of third-degree murder and grand theft. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. With time served and credit for good behavior, she spent about 13 years behind bars. On December 6, 2013, she walked out a free woman. Unlike Adam and John, who remained in the public eye through appeals and parole hearings, Valessa slipped quietly into adulthood. Later reports say she moved far from Tampa, built a family of her own, and lives a private life, one she never could have imagined the night she giggled in a Denny's and agreed to kill the woman who raised her. The story of Valessa Robinson is a brutal reminder of how teenage rebellion can warp into something unthinkable. A mother who fought to save her daughter, a daughter who chose her boyfriend over the woman trying to protect her.
I just wanted to say goodbye to my mama and Jamie since we never got the chance to. I was so used to you guys always being here to the point that I never once thought to imagine y'all not being here. I didn't have a single clue how much I needed y'all until now.
On the morning of February 25th, 2025, deputies in Carroll County, Georgia, walked into a quiet home on Tyus Road, expecting a welfare call. What they found instead was horror. Inside the master bedroom, 41-year-old Kristen Brock and her husband, 45-year-old James Brock, lay dead in their bed, each shot multiple times while they slept. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no shattered windows or broken locks, just one door left slightly ajar, and two parents murdered without a sound. It was their youngest daughter, just 5 or 6 years old, who made the discovery. When her parents wouldn't wake up, she ran to her older sister for help. That older sister was 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, and it was Sarah. He picked up the phone and called 911. At first glance, this looked like a nightmare brought by an unknown intruder, a burglary gone wrong, a targeted hit, something, anything other than a child executing her own parents. But from the moment detectives stepped into that room, things didn't add up. No forced entry, no missing items, no signs of a struggle. And as investigators pulled surveillance footage, analyzed ballistics, and combed through digital evidence, their attention shifted inward to the one person who said she had slept through the gunfire, Sarah Grace Patrick. Over the next several months, while police worked quietly behind the scenes, Sarah turned to the internet. On TikTok, under the name Sarah Grace, she posted emotional videos about losing her parents. She went live. She cried. She talked about grief, anger, confusion. She messaged true crime creators directly, urging them to look into the case. And at her parents' funeral, she delivered an emotional eulogy. The funeral was live-streamed, and prosecutors would later point to her behavior that day as part of the case they were building. Publicly, she looked like a heartbroken daughter. Privately, detectives were collecting what they called mountains of physical and digital evidence. The investigation grew massive. The FBI assisted. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab combed through electronics and forensic traces. Private labs were brought in. Detectives interviewed countless witnesses. And by July 2025, 5 months after the murders, the sheriff's office made an announcement that stunned the entire community. They believed Sarah Grace Patrick murdered her parents. She was arrested and charged as an adult, with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Later, prosecutors added 2 malice murder charges and 2 weapons charges. If convicted on the major counts, she faces life without the possibility of parole. The allegations were deeply disturbing. Investigators say Sarah shot both parents while they slept in their bed. They point to phone data, online activity, and her behavior before and after the killings. They claim her digital footprint, including TikTok videos, live streams, and messages to influencers, was evidence of deception, an attempt to shape a public narrative long before her arrest. The sheriff said the evidence wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. But her defense says the opposite. Her father, Doniel Patrick, her pastor, and several relatives spoke in her favor at her bond hearing in August. They argued she had no history of violence, and, most importantly, that there was no physical evidence placing the gun in her hands. No gunshot residue reported publicly, no forensic link tying her directly to the murders. They insisted the police were wrong, that the real killer could still be out there. Other members of the extended family fiercely disagreed. Some of James Brock's relatives begged the judge not to release her, calling her dangerous and insisting she was responsible. The courtroom was split. Family members on one side, family members on the other. A household that was already shattered, now divided even further. Judge Dustin Hightower denied bond. In the background, stories of family turmoil surfaced. Years of custody battles, allegations of substance issues among adults in the extended family, a blended family with 7 children, navigating complicated dynamics. None of it revealed a motive, but all of it painted a picture of a household with tension behind the scenes. And the question that haunts the case remains unanswered. Why would a 16-year-old kill her parents? Her trial is currently scheduled for January 5th. 2026. And until that verdict arrives, the entire case remains alleged, yet chilling enough to send shockwaves far beyond Carrollton. On a cold February night in 2017, A small house in the 4400 block of West 23rd Place in Gary, Indiana, turned into a slaughter scene. Inside lived 34-year-old mother of three, Jamie Garnett, a woman doing her best to raise her kids in a city battered by poverty and violence. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, but to the people who loved her, she was everything. That made the brutality of her death almost impossible to process. It was just after 2 a.m. on February 13th, 2017, when police were called to Jamie's home. What they walked into shook even veteran officers. Jamie lay dead, stabbed more than 60 times. Not once, not twice. It was the kind of overkill detectives associate with pure rage or complete loss of control. And her 15-year-old daughter, Chastinea Reeves, was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no explanation waiting in the blood-stained rooms, just a murdered mother and a missing teenage girl. Within hours, law enforcement feared the worst, that whoever killed Jamie had snatched Chastinea too. They hit the panic button. An Amber Alert flashed across Indiana. Her photo and description went out on TV, phones, billboards. Police told the public they believed she was in extreme danger. The narrative was simple and terrifying. Someone had slaughtered a mother and kidnapped her child. For about a day, that's what everyone believed. On February 14th, around 2:30 p.m., the story took its first turn. Officers found Chastinea walking alone near 21st Avenue and Carolina Street in Gary. No kidnapper, no restraints, no injuries, just the missing girl from the alert, alive and unharmed, wandering the streets. The Amber Alert was cancelled. Relief swept through local news. But inside the Gary Police Department, the questions were just getting started. Detectives sat Chastinea down and began asking what happened in that house. How had she escaped? Who had taken her? Where had she been? Her answers didn't sit right. The crime scene showed no forced entry, nothing stolen, no obvious signs that a stranger had broken in, killed Jamie, and dragged a teenager out into the night. And as investigators dug deeper, something else surfaced. Other teenagers. 2 other boys, close to Chastinea's age, was suddenly part of the picture. Virgil King, her boyfriend, and Matthew Martin. Both would later be charged as adults for assisting a criminal. Prosecutors said they helped move Jamie's vehicle and dispose of critical evidence, clothing, the murder weapon, items used in the attack. The kidnapping story was falling apart. Within days of the murder, authorities went from telling the public that Chastinea was an abducted victim to quietly treating her as a suspect. By mid-February, she was charged in juvenile court in connection with her mother's murder. And in July 2017, after a waiver process, the case was moved. She would be tried as an adult for murder. The Amber Alert that once symbolized her as a victim became a point of controversy. At one hearing, her defense team argued that police had essentially used the alert system as a tool to smoke her out, not to save a kidnapped child. That legal argument didn't undo what came next, but it added another layer of unease to an already disturbing case. The forensic evidence told a story that Chastinea couldn't talk her way around. Prosecutors had the knife used to stab Jamie more than 60 times. On that knife, in the blood, was a fingerprint that matched Chastinea Reeves. Even her own attorney later admitted she had no chance of winning a trial with evidence like that in front of a jury. Suddenly, the question wasn't if she was involved, it was why. And that's the one part of this story no one has ever fully answered. Family members told the court that Jamie loved her daughter, even when they clashed. Like most mothers of teenagers, she struggled with discipline, attitude, and boundaries. But there was no clear, dramatic, public motive. No insurance plot, no custody war, no secret double life. People close to the family said simply that something snapped. And then, in May 2019, more than 2 years after Jamie's murder, Chastinea made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She pleaded guilty to murder. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no jury, Just a teenage girl standing in an adult courtroom, admitting she killed her mother. The plea deal capped her possible time behind bars at 45 years. Without it, she was staring down up to 65 years in prison. The state agreed, in part because of the complexity of DNA evidence and the desire to avoid dragging Jamie's family through a long, brutal trial. On June 12, 2019, at age 17, Chastinea returned to court for sentencing. This time, she spoke. "If I could go back," she told the judge, "I wouldn't do it. I do miss my mother." The judge, Diane Boswell, was unmoved by her age as a shield. "Your being young doesn't impress me," she said. "You knew better. You knew better than this." Then she imposed the sentence, 45 years in prison. Matthew Martin admitted helping get rid of the knife and clothing and moving the car. He ended up sentenced to time served, about 1 year and 9 months, for assisting a criminal. Virgil King, identified as Chastinea's boyfriend, faced his own charges for removing and concealing evidence, including the murder weapon and the vehicle. They went home. Chastinea went to prison. With credit for time already served and the possibility of reductions, she could see freedom again one day, maybe in her 50s or early 60s. But even if she walks out those gates eventually, nothing will rewind what happened in that house on West 23 Place. There is still no official motive in the record. No neat answer to the question everyone asks when they hear the basics of the story. How does a 15-year-old girl go from an Amber Alert victim to the confessed killer of the mother who raised her? Christmas morning is supposed to be quiet, safe, a day when families wake up to warmth, breakfast, and the illusion that for just one day, the world is gentle. But on December 25th, 2016, inside a small Clinton Township apartment in Michigan, Christmas morning became something unrecognizable, something monstrous. It became the day 17-year-old Delilah Sherwood Evans killed her own mother in a frenzy so extreme that even hardened investigators struggled to describe it without shaking their heads. Her mother, 45-year-old Sonia Riang, was disabled. She used a wheelchair, moved slowly, and needed constant help with daily tasks. Friends described her as kind, soft-spoken, and patient, a woman who had emigrated from South Korea and worked hard to raise her children despite every obstacle life threw at her. But the one thing she never could have predicted was that her biggest danger lived inside her own home. For months leading up to Christmas, Delilah had been spiraling into severe mental illness. Not just depression, not just mood swings. Something deeper, darker, and terrifying. Court records later revealed that she was living in a world built from delusions. She believed her mother was a witch, not metaphorically, a real witch. Some days she claimed Sonia had 2 heads. Other days, she said she transformed into a dragon. She told people her father was Satan and that she saw dark angels watching her. She heard voices. She lost her grip on reality, piece by piece. 2 weeks before the murder, someone filed a petition to have Delilah mentally evaluated. She had allegedly tried to stab her brother. She was hallucinating. She was paranoid. But for reasons no one can fully understand, she was still at home on Christmas morning, still alone with her mother, still teetering between reality and a terrifying fantasy. We will never know exactly what happened inside that apartment right before the attack. There was no argument recorded, no neighbor hearing screams, no phone call that signaled things had reached a breaking point. Whatever sparked the violence, only Delilah knows. But what she did next has been documented in detail. Armed with a knife, she stabbed her mother 124 times. The number isn't an estimate. It's not a sensational embellishment. It's written in black and white in appellate court documents. 124 stab wounds, a level of violence far beyond anything expected from a moment of anger. A woman trapped in her wheelchair as her own daughter descended into a tornado of delusion and bloodshed. And then came the part prosecutors zeroed in on, the part that convinced them Delilah wasn't just out of her mind, but also aware enough to understand She'd done something terribly wrong. According to the evidence, after the attack, Delilah calmly showered. She used bleach to clean blood from surfaces. She covered her mother's body with a blanket. She left the apartment. These weren't random actions. They were cleanup steps. And they became central to the state's argument that despite her mental illness, Delilah still knew she needed to hide what she'd done. Hours later, police found her at a nearby 7-Eleven. She was wrapped in a blanket, distressed. Officers brought her in, and that was the moment the prosecution's case began building itself. During the trial, Delilah's lawyers didn't deny the killing. They didn't try to argue she was innocent. Their defense was singular. She was legally insane. They brought in psychiatric experts who described, in chilling detail, the delusions that had taken over her mind. They testified that she heard voices. They explained her belief that her mother was a witch or a dragon. They talked about her hallucinations, her erratic behavior, and the petition for psychiatric evaluation, filed just days before the murder. But the prosecution had its own experts, and they painted a different picture. They pointed to her shower. They pointed to the bleach. They pointed to the blanket on the body. They argued those actions showed understanding, decision-making, and an effort to hide the crime. They said those details mattered more than the delusions. They said she knew what she was doing. The jury found themselves caught between two truths. Delilah was deeply mentally ill, but she also showed clear signs of trying to cover her tracks. And so they returned a rare verdict. Guilty, but mentally ill. She wasn't acquitted. She wasn't found insane. She was held responsible. And in Michigan, a guilty verdict for first-degree premeditated murder leaves no wiggle room. The sentence is automatic. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Delilah Evans was only 17 when the judge said the words that would determine the rest of her life. Legal challenges came later, arguments about juvenile life sentences, claims of improper questioning of psychiatric experts, but none of them changed her fate. Meanwhile, Sonny's family rebuilt their lives around a permanent absence. They had tried to get help for Delilah. They had tried to intervene, but the system did not move fast enough, and on Christmas Day, everything collapsed. There was no motive, no final explanation, just a mother lost to a child's unraveling mind and a holiday forever stained by violence. In 2009, El Dorado Hills looked like the kind of place where nothing truly dark could grow. A wealthy suburb outside Sacramento, surrounded by quiet hills, clean sidewalks, and high-achieving kids. But behind the front doors of one 2-story home, a relationship was forming between 14-year-old Tyler Witt and 19-year-old Stephen Boston Culver that would turn a picture-perfect neighborhood into the backdrop of one of California's most disturbing teen killer cases. Tyler was bright, artistic, and emotional. Boston was older, aimless, charismatic in a chaotic way that teenagers mistake for depth. He smoked, partied, played at being a tortured musician. And when Joanne, Tyler's mother, a respected engineer with a master's degree, met him, she thought he was just one more older influence her daughter didn't need. What she didn't know, at first, was that the two were already romantically involved. What she didn't know yet was that Boston had been living in her home, renting the extra bedroom, after Tyler convinced her he was like a brother and possibly gay. And what she really didn't know, until she opened Tyler's journal, was that she had been lied to. That journal, filled with explicit descriptions of Tyler and Boston's sexual relationship, changed everything. Joanne did what any responsible parent would do. She took the journal to police and reported Culver for statutory rape. A criminal investigation opened immediately. Boston panicked. Tyler panicked. And together, they built a fantasy. They were Romeo and Juliet. Joanne was the enemy, and any force trying to separate them deserved to die. The two planned to run away to San Francisco and kill themselves together. A dual suicide. A tragic finale. But to do that, they believed they had to eliminate the one person who would report them missing, pursue them legally, and keep Culver out of Tyler's life. They believed they had to kill Joanne. By early June, The relationship between mother and daughter had deteriorated into violent confrontations. A month before the murder, Tyler had been arrested for assaulting Joanne during a 911 call where Joanne could be heard injured and frightened while Tyler screamed in the background. Police intervened, but whatever temporary calm existed afterward didn't last. Then came June 11th. That evening, Tyler laced her mother's dinner with multiple sleeping pills, Benadryl and Tylenol PM. Joanne became groggy, emotional, unsteady. She eventually went to bed, and that's when Tyler unlocked the door and let Boston inside. Sometime after midnight, they walked into Joanne's bedroom. Tyler could hear her mother begging Boston to stop. Tyler stood in the doorway with her ears covered, but she admitted the pleas cut through her hands. Joanne Witt, a mother trying to protect her daughter, died in her own bed, covered by a blanket the killers pulled up after the stabbing. When the sun rose, Joanne was still in that bed, but Tyler and Boston were already on the move. First, they went to a friend, Matthew Whidden, telling him calmly they had just killed Joanne and showing him the bloody knife inside a shopping bag. Matthew didn't go to police immediately, but he would later become a critical witness. Then they drove Joanne's car toward the Bay Area, trying to outrun the investigation. They abandoned the car illegally in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, where it was eventually towed. They drifted around, trying to survive long enough to carry out their suicide pact. Police later searched a San Francisco hotel room connected to them. Inside, they found a bizarre, heartbreaking mix of items: Fruit Loops, cake, and rat poison they had apparently eaten, condoms, marijuana, a suicide note, and a copy of Donnie Darko, the cult film about a doomed teenager, and a countdown to destruction. But even that attempt failed, and on June 16, 2009, 5 days after the murder, police found Tyler and Boston not in a hotel, but at the shops at Tan Foreign, a strip mall in San Bruno, changing clothes behind a dumpster near an AT&T store. They were arrested without a fight. Deputies had just discovered Joanne's body on June 15th, after she failed to show up to work. Her supervisor had called for a welfare check. Deputies found the home freezing cold. A thermostat had been turned way down, likely to slow decomposition. The case moved fast. Prosecutors charged Tyler as a juvenile, but sought adult-level consequences. They said she helped plan the murder, drugged her mother, and stood by during the killing. The defense argued she was scared, manipulated, emotionally fragile, and controlled by a much older man. Eventually, Tyler made her move. She struck a deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for testifying against Culver. She was sentenced to 15 years to life, eligible for parole in her late 20s. Culver went to trial alone, blaming Tyler for everything. The jury didn't buy it. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Tyler served her time, not as a 15-year-old in state prison. That wasn't true, but in juvenile facilities and later adult custody. Over the years, she participated in therapy, education, and treatment programs. And in August 2022, the parole board granted her release. In 2023, Tyler Witt walked out of prison and into the world again. A free woman. Boston Culver never will. Today, the story of Tyler Witt stands as one of the clearest warnings about teenage obsession, manipulation, and the catastrophic fallout of a relationship built on fantasy instead of reality. In the early morning hours of July 7th, 2024, Palm Bay, Florida was dead quiet. A humid, heavy summer night when most people were asleep. But on a short stretch of Benshaw Road Northwest, someone dialed 911, and the first sentence that crackled through the line would instantly shift the entire tone of the night. "Help me." The caller was 16-year-old Julia Grace Agler. Her voice was shaking. She said there'd been a break-in. She said someone smashed into the house with a hammer. She said they were gone now. She said she had been hiding in her room with her dogs. Then, when the dispatcher asked why she kept the dogs in her room, Julia said something that made the operator stop cold. "I didn't want them getting blood on their paws." It was 12:06 a.m. Police arrived fast. Palm Bay officers moved through the house with guns drawn. What they found inside didn't look like a burglary at all. It looked targeted, personal, violent in a way that suggested purpose, not panic. Inside the living room, officers found Kelly McCullum, Julia's mother, late 30s, but young enough that no one expected her life to end on a quiet Sunday morning. She had been shot multiple times. And down the hall, inside the bathroom, police found 22-year-old Matthew Shayrock, her boyfriend. The scene was devastating. 2 bodies, 2 styles of attack. No sign of forced entry, no intruder on camera, no footprints from anyone except the people who lived there. And just minutes earlier, Julia had insisted she hid while a masked stranger murdered them both. Investigators already knew something wasn't right. The first major crack came almost immediately. On the 911 call, Julia said she came out of her room after the intruder left and saw blood everywhere. Yet officers found broken glass sitting on top of one victim and on top of a phone, contradicting her version of events. According to the affidavit, the direction of the glass, the patterns of disturbances, and the items overturned didn't match an outside break-in. And then detectives checked the house's exterior cameras. They saw no intruder, no stranger approaching the home, no getaway, nothing except the people who lived inside, walking in hours earlier, and officers walking out. At this point, the focus shifted. Investigators separated Julia from the house. They began asking about the timeline, the hammer, the intruder, the glass, and as questions built up, the story began to shift. Eventually, detectives say she admitted the break-in narrative wasn't real. Police then took a closer look at the bodies and found something even darker. Both Kelly and Matthew were shot immediately after walking in the door. Julia allegedly waited by the entry area with her mother's .38 caliber revolver taken from Kelly's bedroom earlier that evening. And when they stepped inside, she greeted them with one phrase, "Welcome home." She fired. When she ran out of ammunition, she allegedly pulled out a kitchen knife she had taken earlier. And when Matthew was injured and asked her to take him out of his misery, Julia walked back into her mother's bedroom, grabbed one more round, and returned to the bathroom. The brutality of that sequence stunned even veteran detectives. Even more chilling, officers say she did all of this while 2 dogs stayed safely inside her room. When investigators examined Julia's shoes, they found bloody footprints inside the house matching her tread pattern. The alleged intruder she described had no footprints, no DNA, no presence on camera, nothing. Every piece of physical evidence pointed inward. But this case wasn't just about forensic clues. It was about motive. According to investigators, Julia had been reaching a boiling point with her mother. They say she was angry about her gender transition and angry about Kelly dating someone so young, 22-year-old Matthew. Prosecutors charged her as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. She is being held without bond. Because she is a minor, she cannot face the death penalty in Florida. But if convicted, she faces life in prison. As of the latest official update, no trial date has been set. And at 16 years old, she now sits in a cell waiting for a courtroom to decide whether she spends the rest of her life locked away. The truth will ultimately be decided at trial. Right now, everything remains alleged. In October of 2014, in a village so small, most people in Denmark have never heard of it, a mother was murdered while she slept. And the killer wasn't an intruder, wasn't a stranger, and wasn't someone the community feared. It was her own 15-year-old daughter. Inside a modest family home lived 40-year-old teen Roma Holtegard. Her twin daughters, including Lisa, and the typical tensions you see between a mother trying to set boundaries and a teenage girl intent on breaking them. But Lisa wasn't rebelling with parties or skipping class or drinking. Her rebellion was darker. Older men, online relationships, a fascination with violent extremist videos circulating out of the Middle East. By the time she met 29-year-old Iraqi immigrant Bakhtiar Mohammed Abdullah, Everything inside that house was already heating toward a rupture. Tyne did not approve of her teenage daughter dating a man twice her age. She tried to stop it, tried to intervene, tried to protect both her daughters from what she saw as a dangerous influence. And that's when the shift happened. Lisa's relationship with Abdullah became intense, and according to investigators, she began spending hours alone in her room watching violent propaganda clips, including ISIS videos that were circulating across the internet that year. But the thing that always haunted investigators wasn't the content itself. It was the timing, what she was watching in the hours leading up to the murder. The night of the killing, everything was quiet. Tyne had taken sleeping pills, something she sometimes did. Her daughters were home, nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. At some point in the early hours of October 8th, while her mother slept in her bed, someone picked up a knife. Exactly who held that knife, Lisa or Abdullah, is something the Danish court later said it could not determine beyond a reasonable doubt. But what happened to Tyne was clear. She was stabbed repeatedly, around 20 times. A mother, unconscious, in her own home, attacked while completely defenseless. The violence was intimate. When the stabbing stopped, the house went still again. And then, sometime around dawn, Lisa made a call. She told police she had woken to see a white man running from the house. She said she thought a stranger killed her mother. She said she didn't know what had happened. When officers arrived, they found Tyne's body in her bed, and they found something else. Lisa, calm, too calm, not even visibly shaken for a 15-year-old who had just found her mother butchered. It was the first moment police felt the story slide sideways. The second moment came even faster. Her internet history, extremist videos, execution clips, and the discovery that she had been communicating with Abdullah at odd hours around the time of the murder. As investigators dug deeper, the narrative Lisa had given them began to crumble. The intruder she claimed to see had no footprints, no evidence, no forced entry tied to him. Nothing about her story aligned with the crime scene. And then, the final blow, Abdullah's involvement. The court later concluded the murder was planned, that the teens had coordinated it together, but they couldn't determine who physically stabbed Tyne. Under Danish law, when you plan a murder with someone, and the stabbing was part of that plan, both are guilty of murder. Lisa pointed at Abdullah. Abdullah pointed at Lisa. But the plan was shared. The responsibility was shared. When the trial began, it became one of Denmark's most widely discussed cases in years. Not because of the brutality, though it was brutal, but because the killers were so young, the setting so peaceful, and the alleged influences so extreme. What terrified the public wasn't that a teen had killed her mother. It was the idea that a Danish girl could absorb extremist imagery online, feed those fantasies through a forbidden relationship, and bring them home into her own bedroom. Lisa sat in the courtroom, pale, composed, and expressionless. Abdullah sat across from her, denying everything. The judges came back with a verdict that shocked many, but aligned with the law. Lisa Borch, 9 years in prison. Bakhtiar Mohammed Abdullah, 13 years, followed by deportation. 9 years is the maximum sentence Denmark can impose on someone under 18. 13 for Abdullah reflected both his age and the severity of his role. People debated the case across Europe. Was Lisa manipulated by an older man, radicalized by extremist content? Or was she fully responsible, a teenage girl who helped orchestrate her mother's death? No single explanation ever fully answered everything. But in a tiny Danish village known for nothing at all, a mother died because the daughter she raised chose a world of violence over the home she lived in. In March of 2023, in Valessa, a dense suburb just outside Moscow, a pair of janitors walked toward the dumpsters behind an apartment block, ready to start another cold morning shift. They saw a large bundle wrapped in a bedsheet, crumpled beside the containers. It looked like discarded furniture, or maybe old bedding someone couldn't fit into the trash chute. They pulled the sheet open, and that's when they realized it wasn't garbage at all. It was a woman. Her name was Anastasia Miliskaya. a 39-year-old real estate agent who had moved to the Moscow region to build a better life for her teenage daughter. She worked non-stop, saved obsessively, dreamed of buying her own apartment and taking a seaside vacation. She raised exotic pets, cats, dogs, even a meerkat. She spoiled her daughter with clothes, tech, everything she could afford. She traveled to Chechnya to buy the insulin that worked best for her child. She worked, saved, and sacrificed, like a mother who refused to let her daughter go without. But when police arrived, they saw immediately that this was no accidental death. Anastasia had been strangled. She showed signs of violence, and the wrapping, a bedsheet from someone's home, meant her killer hadn't brought her body here from far away. The killer had been close. As detectives began canvassing the building, they pulled security footage from the nearby entrances. On the grainy video, they saw two figures dragging the sheet-wrapped body from one of the neighboring doorways toward the dumpsters. Not adult men, not masked professionals, teenagers. Detectives zoomed in, enhanced the frames, and traced the figures back inside. They belonged to boys, young boys, 16 years old, a pair of teenage killers, leaving a dead woman outside like trash. The more police dug into the apartment where the boys had come from, the stranger things became. Inside that flat, the one tied to the trash dump, officers found the room where Anastasia had lived with her daughter, but the daughter wasn't there. And then the story took a turn no one in Russia was prepared for, because investigators say the 14-year-old girl, the daughter Anastasia had spent years protecting, wasn't missing. She was involved. In Russian interrogation rooms, one detail kept repeating. The teens said the girl had asked them to do it. She was tired of her mother's rules, tired of the boyfriend drama, tired of restrictions. She wanted freedom, and she believed her mother, the woman who had raised her, supplied her medication, held her through childhood illness, stood in her way. According to official statements leaked to the press, the plan started with a conversation. The daughter told her boyfriend she wanted to get rid of her mother. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't tell her she was being dramatic. He contacted two acquaintances, boys he knew, boys he thought would do anything for money. And money was the hook. Investigators say the girl and her boyfriend promised 350,000 rubles, part of the more than 700,000 rubles in cash she had taken from her mother's savings after the killing. Anastasia had been saving roughly 1 million rubles in total, working toward that dream apartment and vacation she never got to have. The boys agreed, and the plan moved forward. It didn't happen in a dark alley or a forest. No, the murder happened inside Anastasia's own apartment, the place where she thought she was safe, the place where she kept her daughter's insulin cold in the fridge, the place she came home to every night. The two boys waited inside. The daughter and her boyfriend waited on the balcony. They smoked while the killers prepared. And when Anastasia came home from work, when she unlocked the door and stepped inside her own hallway, the boys attacked. One grabbed her from behind in a chokehold. The other covered her nose and mouth. No gunshots, no dramatic fight. Anastasia struggled, and then she stopped moving. Her daughter remained on the balcony through most of it. When one boy knocked and said, "It's done," she and her boyfriend came back inside. Anastasia's body stayed in the apartment for 2 days. The teams continued coming and going, deciding what to do next. Eventually, they removed her bedsheet, wrapped her inside it, and carried her down the stairs. They tried to lift her into the dumpster, but she was too heavy. They left her on the ground beside the containers and walked away. Police traced the daughter and boyfriend quickly. They weren't hiding. They weren't on the run. In fact, they had taken Anastasia's cat, dog, and meerkat with them, traveling to stay with acquaintances and discussing plans to go to the sea with the stolen money. When investigators finally brought the girl in for questioning, she admitted the plan in her first round of interrogation, but later tried to blame her boyfriend entirely, claiming he pressured her, manipulated her, and that she hadn't known what the boys would do. But the records didn't match the second version. The evidence didn't match. Forensic psychiatrists declared her legally sane, not psychotic, not delusional, not confused. In fact, they described her as inclined to manipulate people. not as someone acting out of a break from reality. The boyfriend was sane too. There was no insanity defense to fall back on. In court, the girl's grandparents arrived in tears. They had raised her through childhood illness. They refused to believe she was involved. Then witnesses, evidence, and testimony made them sink into a different kind of grief. The grief of realizing the child they'd loved had helped destroy the daughter they'd raised. The sentences came down hard. The girl, 8 years. The boyfriend, 8.5 years. One killer, 6 years. The other killer, 9 years. No suspended terms. No soft juvenile penalties. Just 8 years in a Russian penal system for a girl who ordered her own mother's murder at 14. Some relatives argue her diabetes makes incarceration dangerous. They fight for mercy. Others say mercy isn't deserved. The country remains split, horrified not just by the crime, but by how young the architect of it was. And in the middle of it all sits the true price. A mother who spent her life protecting her daughter was killed in an apartment paid for by her hard work, using a plan her daughter set in motion for money her mother had earned, and for freedom her mother was trying to control only because she loved her. In Ipswich, England, in the summer of 2009, the streets around Victoria Street and Limerick Close weren't places people aspired to live. They were places people drifted into. Drinkers, addicts, men and women who survived on cheap cider and whatever they could steal or borrow. A world of violence, poverty, and chaos. This was the world 15-year-old Lorraine Thorp was raised in. She didn't grow up in a home. She grew up in a circle of street drinkers, middle-aged alcoholics who fought each other for spare change, lived in squalid flats and tents, and were already well known to police long before she ever appeared on their radar. Lorraine drifted between placements in special schools and the collapsing life of her father, but every time social services tried to pull her out, she slipped right back into the only community she understood. The drinkers treated her like a mascot, a pet, a kid who could run errands for alcohol. She needed them for survival. They used her because she was young. It was a doomed little orbit of broken adults and one child slowly mirroring every ugly thing she saw. And at the center of it all stood two people. 41-year-old Rosalind Ross Hunt, another entrenched street drinker, and 41-year-old Paul Clark, a violent, controlling alcoholic whose influence over Lorraine would become catastrophic. The accepted trigger wasn't some dramatic betrayal or a police report. It was a row about a dog. One small argument between Ross, Clark, and Lorraine exploded into something grotesque. According to the investigation, Clark convinced himself that Ross had disrespected him, and Lorraine, who craved Clark's approval like oxygen, aligned herself instantly with him. This wasn't a slow burn. This was a switch flipping, and once it did, Ross became the target of a violence spiral unlike anything Ipswich had seen in decades. They didn't kill her in one night. They tortured her for days. They lured Ross to Clark's filthy flat. Once she was inside, the beatings began. Lorraine, 15 years old, joined Clark in humiliating and annihilating the woman she had once clung to for emotional support. Lorraine didn't look horrified. According to later testimony, she appeared to laugh, to enjoy it, to treat the violence as entertainment. Judges would say she found brutality funny and entertaining, that she appeared to glory in what they were doing to Ross. Over the course of days, Ross became a prisoner in Clark's flat, too injured to escape, too weak to stand, trapped with the two people systematically destroying her, until her body simply couldn't survive any longer. On August 9th, police forced entry into her home after concerns from the public. They found her dead. And the moment Clark and Lorraine realized Ross was gone, another fear set in. Desmond Thorp, Lorraine's 43-year-old father, knew too much. Desmond was a vulnerable, disabled alcoholic who lived in a grim flat in Limerick Close. He wasn't a danger to anyone. He wasn't a liability, except in one way. If police came knocking, he would talk. Clark couldn't allow that, and Lorraine, who wanted Clark's approval more than her father's life, agreed. The attack on Desmond was fast and sickening. They smothered him with a cushion while he lay helpless, then kicked him repeatedly. He died on that floor, beaten and suffocated by the child he had raised in brokenness. The next day, August 10th, police found Desmond dead. 2 murders in 2 days, both tied to the same people. Both tied to a 15-year-old girl and the older man she followed without hesitation. When officers finally picked up Lorraine, she didn't look confused or broken. She didn't look lost. She didn't look manipulated in the way her defense later tried to argue. Judges described her as stubborn, willful, and capable of extreme manipulation. A child, yes, but a child who had adapted to cruelty so completely that she learned to wield it herself. In court, prosecutors laid out the timeline: 9 days of escalating violence, torture, domination, and murder. A girl raised in filth and brutality who became brutal herself. The jury didn't take long. In 2010, Lorraine Thorp became Britain's youngest female double murderer, sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 14 years. Clark received life with a minimum of 27 years. He never saw freedom again. He died in prison in 2014, believed to have taken his own life. Lorraine remains incarcerated at HMP Fuston Hall. Her 2023 parole review denied release. She will be reviewed again, but early release is far from guaranteed. From the teenagers who murdered out of rage to the ones who killed for love, revenge, or pure thrill, these 10 stories reveal just how dark youth can turn when guidance collapses and violence fills the void. They are children who became predators, sons and daughters who betrayed the very people who raised them, and their crimes remain some of the most chilling reminders that evil doesn't wait for adulthood. If you found this deep dive into these horrifying cases gripping, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments below which of these teen killers unsettled you the most.